Greetings and welcome back to another wristwatch video. In today's video, as you can see by the title, we are talking about vintage watches. More specifically, I came up with 7 reasons why I think everybody should own at least one vintage watch in their collection. Now, in the wristwatch community, people are a lot more focused on new watches, new things, something new comes out, everybody wants the new, the best, the most recent watch. However, vintage watches are not really explored as much as they could be. They're always a bit more in the backstage, at least in the wristwatch community. And I think that's wrong. I think you can find a lot of cool vintage pieces for a low price. So that's why I came up with this video. Of course, I have a bunch of vintage watches in my collection as well. I made a video going over my entire wristwatch collection. So there you can check out what vintage watches or overall, if you're interested in what watches I have in my collection. And link to that video is in the description, of course, of this video. Now, before you do all that wristwatch check, what am I wearing today? Today, because of the theme of this video, I'm wearing my vintage watch, my vintage Omega Deville dress watch. This is a beautiful little quartz piece, and I will be making a review of this watch very soon. Now, the first thing we gotta do is actually settle the debate. What is a vintage watch? What qualifies as a vintage watch? Essentially, we have to look at the age. A vintage watch is any watch that is at least 40 years old. So anything younger than that does not really or cannot really be considered as a vintage watch. So your Seiko 5 from the year 2000 or from 1990, it still has a little bit of way to go before it's considered a vintage watch. But now let's start with the reasons, starting with the first reason I think everybody should own at least one vintage watch. It is that every watch has a story. Now, admittedly, this is more of a romantic view, but it's an aspect I enjoy about vintage watches, that every single watch has a story behind it. Every owner wore that watch through his best or worst times. Every dent, every scratch on the watch tells a story. And what I think is cool, that you are the person that continues that story. So maybe it's your grandfather's watch, your father's watch, like for example, this is my grandfather's watch, or maybe you bought a vintage watch somewhere. You're continuing the story of that person. You're making your own dents, you're making your own little part, your little piece, and maybe then your son, daughter, whatever, can inherit that watch and they can continue that story on forward. Again, slightly romantic view, but I think it's still a pretty good reason, pretty cool reason to own a vintage watch. The second reason I would say is that you can buy a mechanical watch for a fairly low price. Now, to be honest, you have a lot of new mechanical watches on the market today, like, I don't know, Vostok's watches from AliExpress, for example. However, if we're talking about Swiss timepieces, you cannot buy a new mechanical Swiss watch for like $100 to $200 price range. So the only way you can do that is if you buy a vintage watch, and you can buy some pretty cool vintage watches with pretty cool mechanical movements inside them. For example, I bought an Holokron dress watch. Holokron is a Swiss brand, or at least was a Swiss brand. And I bought that watch. It's a manual wind with small seconds complication watch. And I bought that watch for under $10. And it was still working, by the way. So it was in working condition for under $10, which I think is a steal. I brought it to my watchmaker. He made some service and movement. He cleaned up the dial. So I paid like $20, $30 extra, but still, for under $50, I got a beautiful little mechanical Swiss dress watch. So I think that's pretty cool. You can definitely buy mechanical watches for a fairly low price. So up to $100, you can buy a lot of different brands easily. Next would be that vintage watches are excellent for practice if you want to learn how to service a movement. So if you want to take this hobby to the next level and learn how to service a movement, learn how to service a watch, I think it's a lot cheaper, a lot more financially responsible to buy vintage watches for a low price. Like I said, my Holokron, I buy them for $10, and then you can practice servicing your movements on watches like that. So like, for example, I think that would be better than if you buy a Seiko 5 for like $200, $300 and maybe you break something. If you buy something for like $10, $20, $50, then it's not so much of a waste of money, even if you manage to completely ruin the watch. So if you want to go into this hobby a bit more further, if you want to learn how to service movements yourself, maybe start with vintage watches. And that's why I think, again, you should maybe get a vintage watch for your collection if you're interested in going to that next step. Next reason is that you have something different. Basically, in a world where everybody will wear a G-Shock or a smartwatch, or maybe, I don't know, a Rolex Submariner or a fake Rolex Submariner at least, you definitely have something different, something more unique, that stands out and is more interesting on your wrist. Like, I don't know if a single person in my country wears this watch, but I have it and I think it's pretty cool. So I think, yes, you have something different is definitely another reason, if you want to be a bit more unique, a bit more of an individual, that you buy a cool vintage timepiece. Also, something a bit more personal to me, a bit more close to me, is the size of the watch. You can easily find a smaller size watch if you're into smaller watches like me. So for example, I prefer smaller dimensions between like 34 and 38 millimeters for a men's dress watch. So the more traditional sizes, if you will. And while while brands overall are starting to make those smaller models again, like Orient made a smaller version of the Bambino, for example, still the easiest place is to buy a vintage watch, because more or less most vintage men's dress watches, or watches in general, were between 38 and 38 millimeters, because that was the normal size for that time period. So if you're like me, if you prefer smaller watches, then it is way easier to find it if you are looking in the vintage market. Also, another reason is that they never go out of style. So vintage watches, the way that they are designed, that they are made, it is a classic. You can never go wrong. Just like leather dress shoes, sorry, never go out of style, vintage watches also never ever go out of style. And you can wear them to more or less any occasion. Well, maybe except if you're doing some sports, then maybe a Omega Deville is not exactly appropriate. But for anything else, yes, a vintage watch is always appropriate. It's always in style. And the final reason, one not so close to me, but still I think a lot of people care about this, is that you can get a strong brand for fairly low amount of money. So a lot of people in this hobby like brands. They like to wear a strong brand on their wrist, like Omega, Tissot, Longines, etc. And let's face it, if you want to buy a new Omega, it's gonna cost you a pretty penny. But if we look in the vintage market, you can get an Omega from like $200 to $500, no problem at all. So that's why I think that can also be considered as a reason. Again, not so close to me. I don't really care how strong the brand is, but a lot of people do. So if you want to buy a Longines watch, but you want to spend like $1,000, $2,000, you can buy a vintage Longines for like $200, $300, and I guess, I don't know, I guess that would make you happy, because some people just care about the brand. But yes, that is my final reason why I think everybody should have at least one vintage dress watch or vintage watch overall in their collection. And that's pretty much it. I don't know if you agree with me on these reasons. If you don't, please leave a comment down below, or maybe there is another reason, so maybe you can add your reasons in the comments of this video as well. Overall, I really enjoyed making this video. I like vintage watches. I'm liking them more and more as I get more and more of them. And I hope you also buy one and realize that it's a pretty cool little part of this hobby. So if you like this video, of course, as always, leave a thumbs up. If you dislike the video, leave a thumbs down, and maybe give me some suggestions on how I can improve my content. Subscribe if you want to see more wristwatch or fragrance related videos. And until next time, guys, have a great day and